So good morning again, everyone. Thank you all for being here. So we've arrived at the beginning of fall, and we don't have the official start with the equinox for a couple of weeks, but we're at the start of the school year. We've got Peanut Patch coming back, and it's always a pleasure to have the kids in the building after they've been gone for a while. So we're beginning our fall worship series too. And we had an enjoyable 7-week worship series, sermon series, I should say, about the gospel in popular culture. Last week, for anyone who missed it, we had a fascinating discussion about the gospel in comics, and we focused on the character of Superman. We looked at Superman's origins as a Jewish mystical figure, as a religious prophet with the power to deliver the masses from suffering. And we then explored the evolution of the character into a Christ-like Messiah figure who's been sent down from heaven and commissioned by his God-like Father to do his ministry here on earth. So the evolution of the character and of his meaning have in some ways reflected the evolution of our biblical scriptures, the fulfillment of different covenants with God, first that of the Old Testament, and then later that of the Gospel and of the New Testament. So it does feel pretty appropriate following that we're now entering a fall series that's going to attempt to reconnect all of us with our biblical scriptures. And we're informally going to call it Back to the Bible. This will be, as we said, less of a specific set of weeks and more of an ongoing theme. And we're still going to use PowerPoints from time to time, but we're not going to do them every week for now. We need to give the projector a little break as it stands. But we are going to have this theme as we move toward the end of Pentecost and toward the beginning of Advent. So for today, we're going to take a few minutes and reacquaint ourselves with the biblical scriptures. So I'll ask you all to do something a little bit different than we normally do. You all have pew Bibles in front of you. Go ahead and grab one of those pew Bibles and take it out. Some of you might do this anyway when we do our scriptures. We give you the page numbers and we invite you to read along. So for today, we'll encourage you all to follow along. Really, you don't have to follow along. It's just a little exercise we're going to do. So open up to the table of contents in your Bibles. You'll notice we have a couple different kinds of tables of contents. You'll see the first one, where everything's split chronologically into the Old Testament and the New Testament. That makes sense, right? But you'll see on the next page as well, everything is listed alphabetically. So if you're looking for a certain book of the Bible, but you're not sure where it's located, you can use the alphabetical list. But if you know where the book occurs and you're just not sure on which page it begins, you can use that first one. So anyone ever look at this table of contents to find the thing, or you just rely on the page? Okay, Ken does, Marilyn does, yeah. You can rely on the page numbers in the bulletin as well. So it's very helpful. It's a good tool to have. So we'll use that as a guide for this morning. So we're going to stay in that first list, that chronological one where it's split between the Old and the New Testament. This is the first and simplest division of books in the Bible. We've got 66 books here, 39 in the Old Testament, we've got 27 in the New Testament, and the division here is very straightforward. Books written before the time of Jesus are in the Old Testament, books written after the life and ministry of Jesus are in the New Testament. And we all know this already. Today is just about reacquainting ourselves and reviewing some of what we already know, reminding ourselves. So beyond that first division, what do we have? We've got multiple divisions within each testament, don't we? It might look in that table of contents like it's just a random list of books and weird names, but it's not. So there's a structure beyond just this division. And the structure is based on different types of literary genres. So a few weeks back, we talked about the gospel in literature, and we noted that there were many different kinds of literary genres that have been explored over the years. This has always been true, going back to ancient times, and it is also true of the Bible. So for instance, the book of Psalms is very, very different from the book of Genesis, and the Gospel of Matthew is very, very different from the book of Revelation. Really, everything is different from the book of Revelation, but that's another talk for a later day. So what are those literary genres? Well, we probably know a lot of them already, but we're going to review today. How is the Bible organized? Well, let's take the Old Testament first. Now, many of us know and remember the first 5 books of the Old Testament, right? The first 5 books of the Bible. We have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Together, these make up what is sometimes called the Pentateuch, meaning 5 books or 5 scrolls. The penta prefix is your clue there, right? In the Jewish tradition, these are called the 5 books of Moses or the Torah. Genesis, of course, we all know this. It tells the story of the creation. It recounts the heritage of the Jewish people. You have the story of Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden. You have Cain and Abel. You have Noah and the ark. And you have the stories of the ancestors of the Israelites, right? The first ones, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, with whom God establishes the first biblical covenant. And covenant is a really important theme around which all of these scriptures are organized. Covenant is very, very important. Genesis also tells the story of Joseph, who is sold into slavery in Egypt by his brothers prior to the Jewish Exodus. The next book, of course, tells the story of that Exodus, the birth of Moses, his return to Egypt, and he frees the Hebrew slaves. It accounts the 10 plagues of Egypt and describes the flight of the Jewish people into the land of Canaan following that liberation. The next 2 books, Leviticus and Numbers, describe the early history of the Jewish people in Canaan and their attempts to establish a set of laws and for how they should build their society and govern themselves. Finally, Deuteronomy, and we're not going to do this with every book. We're reviewing what we already know. Deuteronomy gives the final words of Moses to the Jewish people, as well as a summary of the previous books. But if you're looking in the contents, following those 5 books, it gets a little more dense and a little more murky, doesn't it? It's harder to remember. So after the Pentateuch, you'll see the histories of the Old Testament, and there's lots of them. These include Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. All right, everybody see where we are? Everybody following along? Yep. So these books continue the historical account of the Jewish people, and they record the events from the time of Joshua, who became their leader following the death of Moses, to roughly the time of their return from exile, some 1,000 years later. So we see Israel in these books go through a lot of ups and downs, transitioning from the time of Judges to the period of Kings, kings like David and Solomon and Samuel. We see it go through the division of its kingdom into north and south, or Judah and Israel. We observe the moral decline of both of these kingdoms and ultimately their collapse and the captivity or exile of the Jewish people. It is an experience that defined this faith community, and it's one of the longest and most dense portions of the Bible, and it's filled with fascinating historical accounts. So after the histories, we still have a lot to go in the Old Testament. We have next the wisdom literature. So this would include the book of Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon, also called Song of Songs. I think it's Song of Songs in our Pew Bible. Either one works. So these are some of the most interesting and poetic books of the Bible. They're filled with all kinds of beautiful imagery and metaphors for holy, faith-based living. Now, you all know that we use the book of Psalms almost every week in our worship service, and we occasionally enjoy readings of wisdom from books like Proverbs or Job. We're actually going to spend a bit of time in Job later this fall, too. So these books they follow the histories, and they precede the many prophets of the Old Testament, and there are many prophets in the Old Testament. And the prophets, like everything else in these books, are also divided into different categories. So if you're following along, you'll see that the prophets are the final literary genre of the Old Testament. They're going to take us all the way forward into the gospel. And you'll see that they include major and minor prophets. So the major prophetic books would be Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel, followed by the 12 minor prophets, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. That's quite a mouthful. How many of us had to memorize all those minor prophets in Sunday school when we were here? I see Marion's hand is up. Okay, a few others. All right. So I'm sure some of us have memorized all of these in order at one point. Knowing these categories is what helps you remember all of these books. And even I can't name them all. My brain's not that sharp. I need a guide to remind me what all the names are. Now, with respect to the prophets, there is no clear-cut theological reason why they're separated into major and minor, other than just by size. The major prophets are well known and more often read because they're bigger than the minor prophets, and they have more content. So we tend to be more familiar with them, and we tend to give them priority treatment. So this takes us into the New Testament. And we're a little more familiar with the New Testament. We all know, of course, that it begins with the 4 books of the gospel. And the gospel literally means good news. We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all of which give different accounts of the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. Most notably, his birth, his teachings to the disciples in his ministry, his death on the cross, and his resurrection. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are often referred to as the synoptic gospels because they have a lot of the same material and they come from similar sources. Whereas John stands apart from the others and it gives a different, at least in terms of themes and language and imagery, a different portrayal of Christ and his time on earth. The theological foundation is the same, but a lot of the tactics and tools are different in John. And we've learned to divide the Gospels themselves into smaller sections, such as the Johannine Prologue, the Book of Signs or Miracles, the Book of Glory, and the Passion. So that's the Gospel, and we know that one. We read from it every week. The rest of the New Testament, for those of us following along, is comprised of the Epistles, the writings of the earliest followers of Jesus. These all happened during what we call the Apostolic Age, the age following Jesus, during which the apostles sought to record his life and ministry and share it with the world. Most of these epistles are written by the Apostle Paul. We talk about Paul a lot. I talk about Paul a lot because I have a very complicated relationship with Paul, and it's a fun thing to struggle through. Paul, we all know, was originally called Saul of Tarsus. He was a man who had one of the first documented conversion experiences. It's a common misconception that Paul was one of the original 12 disciples. He was not. We all know that in here. Paul was a Jew and a Roman citizen prior to his conversion, and after, technically. So he used this status after that conversion to reach a lot of different audiences in the book and in these epistles. You have the book of Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, right, to the people of Corinth in what is now Greece. Galatians to the people of Galatia, the region that is now central Turkey. Ephesians to the people of Ephesus, a city in what is now Turkey. Philippians to Philippi. Colossians to the area of Colossus. 1st and 2nd Thessalonians to Thessaly or Thessalonica. 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, and Hebrews, which is disputed. Not every authorship is fully known, but most of these are attributed to Paul. He was one of the central figures of this age, and his writings have become extremely important to churches like ours, churches around the world. Now, the remaining books of the New Testament, you'll see that there are still a few left if you're following along. Those are called the general epistles. Those are epistles written by those other than Paul. So the general epistles are written by various other authors of the apostolic age. They're grouped together at the back, again, because they're a little shorter. They're not quite as long. It's just like the prophets in the Old Testament. There's not that much of a theological difference there. The general ones are later because they're a little shorter. The Pauline ones are longer. So the general epistles include James, which we heard from today, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, Jude, and depending on who you talk to, the book of Hebrews. So you might notice that we did skip over a couple in here. First, the book of Acts. Acts would be the first book following the four Gospels, before the book of Romans, the first epistle from Paul. And Acts is considered the only real historical book of the New Testament, whereas you have large chunks of history in the Old Testament. Acts gives an historical account, literally, of the actions of the apostles following the time of Jesus. And it's often attributed, its authorship is often associated with that of the book of Luke. Luke and Acts are often grouped together in exegetical circles. And finally, the last book, which really is a category all of its own, which would be probably the category of prophetic or apocalyptic literature, the book of Revelation. So, it's all there. It's all right there in front of you. And you can see that there is a structure. There is a rhyme and a reason and an order to these books. You might call it a canon, right? The official set of books. Sometimes it's chronological, sometimes it's author-related or thematic. But what we're going to do this fall is start here by taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture of the biblical scriptures that helps us to put things into a broader context, to understand them better, and to really figure out how to apply the gospel teachings of Jesus in the world today. So that's what we're going to do over the course of the fall. And as we said, we're going to bring back our PowerPoints with some of our messages, and we're going to try to start using them in worship a little bit too, for prayers and whatnot, but we'll give our projector a break for a little bit. We're going to work together to understand how and why these scriptures are so important. We're going to revisit that theme of covenant. And of course, every week we're going to give thanks for these scriptures, for this word of God, that they make known to all of us the good news that Christ is alive and that we are all beloved children of God. So thanks be to God, and amen.